I would love to hear you disprove evolution. Can we do that?
Well, the main issue with evolution is the following. The main issue with evolution is we have taken enormous scientific leaps in the fossil records, right? So if evolution is true, then you find single-celled or multi-celled organisms, right? And you go from single-celled or two-celled organisms to four-celled, to eight-celled, to 16-celled. You go through a progressive evolution, if you will, of these organisms evolving into an increasingly more being-like creature. So evolution says basically that some bacteria got together in a mud puddle and they mated, and we went from single-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms to quadricellular to hexacellular to multicellular, and then these organisms began to form into systems that created organ systems, and then you basically had what is a rudimentary non-air breathing organism that was in the water to an organism that had gills, and then those gills moved out onto land, and then they started to breathe oxygen, and then this whole lineage of species evolved from this. The problem is there's zero evidence of that. The problem is you have these single-celled organisms and multi-celled organisms, and then there's just a giant gap in the fossil record. And you have animals, and then you have man. But we don't have a fossil record that takes us from single and multi-celled organisms into an entire species. And we just simply ignore that.
Wow.
And so
I didn't know that.
we ignore the science that would validate that evolution was. And two, for me, when I really study the human body, and by the way, we have barely scratched the surface of understanding, this thing that God created. It is fascinating in its ability. Modern medicine will say, well, that was a miracle cure. It's not a miracle cure. It's when people are miraculously cured from things, it's because they figured out the deficiency, or they figured out that we're an entire being. We've lost faith in the ability that this has over this. The medicine treats our mental health and our physical health almost as separate creatures. And so you destroy somebody's gut health, their mental health will follow. You will not have, again, I've never met a patient that suffers from anxiety that didn't have gut issues. So what I'm saying is you have this perfectly beautiful organism. You have these communities of trillions of cells. God gave us everything that we need to thrive. Everything that we need to thrive. The best research that is being done on the surface of Mother Earth right now is being done on the basics that God gave us. Magnetism from the earth, oxygen from the air, light from the sun, whole foods, minerals from that you would get if you scooped water out of a flowing stream, grounding by discharging into the earth and changing the polarity of your body, repolarizing the surface of your blood cells, learning to actually allow sunlight into your eyes and to touch your skin. We're very photovoltaic beings. And so what happens when we start to disconnect from Mother Nature? What happens when we start to disconnect from what God gave us and replace it with what man made us? This is how we become sick and diseased and pathological. And the reason why I say that is that this whole ecosystem was meant to work as an entire ecosystem. You can't take pieces of it out and expect to maintain a state of optimal health. So for example, if you look at our circulatory system, very few people realize that only 30% of our blood is circulated by our heart. Right? Our heart's only responsible for 30% of the circulation in our body. 70% of our circulation is actually not done by the heart. 70% of our circulation is done by an activity called vasomotor. Okay, this is microvascular circulation. Nobody listening to this podcast has a heart that is strong enough in a single contraction to pump blood all the way to the tip of your toes, to the tip of your fingers, through all the capillaries in your brain, your liver, your lungs, your pancreas, your kidneys, none of us. What happens is we pump blood to the entrance of these capillaries, and then an activity called vasomotor takes over. Think of a snake swallowing a mouse. Okay, so what happens as we age to these capillaries, to this microvascular circulation? Well, as we deprive it of sunlight, which we very often do, it becomes deconditioned, if you will. You lose the vascular laxity. Blood flow begins to decrease. The reason why most people start wearing readers in their 50s is not because their eyesight is physically changing, but because the blood flow to the back of their eyes is changing. When we don't change, when we don't vary our temperature, right? Expose ourselves to cold temperatures, expose ourselves to hot temperatures. When we just keep our temperature perfectly normal, we stop exercising our vascular system. Our arteries are smooth muscle. They can actually contract and expand. We don't think about exercising our vascular system, but it's actually very good for you. One of the reasons why I love cold water exposure, taking a cold shower, getting in a cold plunge or a cold tub, is because you're exercising your vascular system. You're causing a peripheral vasoconstriction and a vasodilation, which is actually very, very good for maintaining this microvascular circulation. But we just maintain our body temperature and air temperature and our car temperature and our temperature in our office and our temperature in our home, because we don't like to be uncomfortable. We got to stop telling grandma not to go outside, it's too hot, not to go outside, it's too cold, just to lay down, just to relax, just to eat at the very first pang of hunger. This is collapsing all of our natural defense mechanisms. And so one of the reasons, getting back to evolution, is you look at how this human body is structured, and you see that, for example, an artery will have a certain diameter, and it carries this warm oxygenated blood away from the heart. And then wrapped around this artery, comprising the same diameter, but divided into smaller little pipes, are the veins. And the veins are smaller in diameter, and they're wrapped around the artery to improve the heat exchange. And so you start digging into this, and you're like, this is like the most sophisticated engineer in the world designed this system, because the warm fluid that's leaving changes the temperature of the cool fluid that's coming back. And the way you change the temperature is you divide the same diameter into smaller pipes, and you wrap it around this other pipe. You don't see arteries and veins like this. You see artery and veins like this. And so and I could give you 1,000 examples of this. It's just incredible how the body can, when you fast, for example, your body goes into the state called autophagy, where it actually starts to eat cells that are useless in the body. It recycles them, right? You look at any faith in the world, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindu, you look at any major religion in the world, they all have periods of fasting. And they have periods of fasting because fasting wasn't just to deprive you of, pleasures of the flesh. It was to heal you. It was actually designed, when we didn't have the medications that we have today, it was designed to cleanse and heal the body. Because when you go into a fasted state, this miraculous condition starts to emerge where your body efficiently sends the immune system out into the world, and it starts to eat the useless cells in your body and break them apart into the amino acids that we use other places for energy. It's
kidding.
so incredibly efficient. It's like, the greatest PhD chemist in the world designed the chemical component. The greatest architectural engineer in the world designed the architecture of it. The structure of it is so incredible. If you look at how we take the same minerals and create bone, calcium, phosphorus, form hydroxyapatite, create this bone, and then we warehouse a factory inside the bone that creates the red blood cells, and the red blood cells are responsible for shuttling the gases around in the body. And this ecosystem is so intelligent, and it couldn't, and not in my opinion, but in the scientific evidence, it could not have been put together by accident. It didn't happen by happenstance. And don't tell me about genetic evolution, because, genetically, we've been told things like, we pass disease from generation to generation, which is in most cases is patently false. Like, you'll have a lot of listeners right now that you will either have type 2 diabetes, or they'll have hypothyroid, or they'll have high blood pressure, or they'll have drug and alcohol addiction runs in their family, or depression and anxiety runs in their family. And they have been told that these are genetically inherited diseases, right? Because something runs in families does not mean it's genetically inherited. This is another farce that has been promulgated on the populace, because if I can convince you that you have a genetically inherited disease, I can convince you that you need to subscribe to a lifetime of medication. So you come in to see me as your doctor, and I look at your blood pressure and I go, Sean, you have high blood pressure. You go, well, why do I have high blood pressure? I go, well, I don't know. You have a normal EKG, you have a normal EEG, you have normal heart sounds, you have normal lung sounds, you have a normal dye contrast study. I did all these tests on your heart, and there's nothing wrong with your heart. Why do I have high blood pressure? Well, because your grandfather had it, or your uncle had it. So it's familial. It's genetically inherited. The next time a physician says that to you, you need to look them dead in the face and say, what gene did I inherit from my ancestor that gave me that condition? And watch their face go blank. Because things run in families does not mean that you have a genetic disease. What we pass from generation to generation is, for the most part, is not disease. It is
Habits.
and nutrient deficiencies, both of which are fixable, right? Go to Google right now and say, what percentage of hypertension is idiopathic, meaning of unknown origin? 85%. You mean to tell me 85% of the time they diagnose you with high blood pressure, they have no idea what's causing it? That's exactly what I mean. So what do we do in the 85% of cases where we don't know the origin of high blood pressure? We medicate the heart. What do we do in the 85% of cases that we don't know why you have hypothyroid? We medicate the thyroid. And so you want to talk about a pandemic in this country. We have a pandemic of holding organs responsible for crimes they're not committing. So many people that are listening to this podcast right now either have high blood pressure or they have a loved one with high blood pressure. And the type of high blood pressure they were diagnosed with is idiopathic hypertension, unknown origin hypertension. Then they were told because an ancestor had it, they inherited it. But there is no gene for that condition. So it cannot be genetic. And so the same thing happens with thyroid. We diagnose people with low thyroid, and I'm going to point this out on your labs. Generally, broadly, because they have low T3 hormone, right? So the thyroid makes two hormones, T4 and it makes T3. But the little known fact about the thyroid is that it only makes 20% of the T3 hormone in your blood. So if T3 is low, there's an 80% chance it's not your thyroid. But what do we do when T3 is low? We call it hypothyroid and we medicate the thyroid. So the question should be, where's the other 80% come from? The other 80% comes from outside the thyroid. It's deiodinized in the liver, which is about 2/3 of the thyroid hormone T3. The rest of it comes from the gut and the periphery. But the point is, between the liver, the gut, and the periphery, this is outside of the thyroid. We just hold the thyroid responsible for a crime it's not committing, instead of looking at, well, what nutrients, selenium, thiamine, zinc, which are very, very common, selenium, very common deficiencies in thyroid conditions, less often iodine. But before we look to see if the body has the right raw materials, the right nutrients, we assume disease and pathology. And now we're whacking a perfectly healthy organ, accusing it of a crime it's not committing, and people subscribe to a lifetime of the medication because they were told it's genetic, because their grandmother or their uncle or their aunt had it, and there's no gene to pass it on to them. And so these are the kinds of again, this brings me back to the discussion about faith, because God gave us everything that we need to thrive. If you can't find it on the surface of the earth, you probably don't need it to live a healthy, happy, long, thriving life, right? It's when we start picking up the things that God didn't give us. We start eating highly processed foods, glyphosates, preservatives, pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, fake foods, dyes, the MSGs, the genetically modified foods, which are not even foods. And we start putting these non-natural compounds into the body. Now we become diseased and sick and pathological. And now we're relying on chemicals and synthetics and pharmaceuticals to fix the pathology that was caused by the chemicals, the synthetics, and the pharmaceuticals. It's such a vicious cycle. But if we go back to what God gave us, meat, fish, chicken, eggs, vegetables, sunlight, grounding, breath work, exercise, nature, water that is free of, glyphosate and free of chlorine and free of fluoride and microplastics and pharmaceuticals, you'd find that we could fix this entire pandemic of chronic disease in the country. Just going back to what God gave us.
Wow. So you're not eating Bill Gates' fake meat.
This lab-grown meat. Italy banned that shit, man. It's crazy. I mean, stem cell grown meat. I mean, that's
Pretty
a tough
wild,
one.
huh?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And now we want to blame greenhouse gases on cow farts, and I'm like, this is.
Well, that's a fascinating conversation we just had. I got a